Thank you very much. So this roundtable or panel discussion really draws on some discussions we've been having over the last half a year in Task Force 2 and beyond around thinking about digital public infrastructure. And what this concept really does is it draws our attention to the digital foundations and building blocks for thinking about innovation, inclusion, and competition now and going forward. And what we have here with this panel is what's really exciting is that, well, India has really been at the forefront in thinking around what digital public infrastructure entails, what it can look like, both in public policy and public technology. There has been other initiatives as well around the world, and what our panel here really offers is a variety of global perspectives in thinking about what approaches have we seen to digital public infrastructure? What has been working? Where are the challenges? And what can we take from these lessons going forward to think together about how this concept of digital public infrastructure can help equip us for, again, more inclusive, innovative, and competitive digital technologies going forward. So what I want to do is I want to start by asking each of our panelists, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I'm rude, but I'm going to cut you off after you've spoken for 5 minutes so that we can keep things moving, maybe 4 actually, 4 or 5 minutes. But I want to start by actually just maybe going down the row here and asking you first to just comment on where you've seen some of the successes around digital public infrastructure. What has worked from your perspective in terms of approaches, or maybe what hasn't? Where do you see sort of the opportunities here and what's taken place so far? So Kendrick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Stephanie. So, delighted to be here. On the topic of digital public infrastructure, I think, the opportunities that have arisen is that those countries that have successfully managed to lay the foundation for digital public infrastructure actually put themselves in a very, very good position, right, to capitalize upon a lot of developments, globally, worldwide. So you're looking at things like, participating in the digital economy and being more responsible for innovation overall. And as you know, digital public infrastructure, to even get to that stage, you need to have the actual foundational enablers in place. So you're looking at things like, digital skills, digital literacy, having internet connectivity, all those things need to be in place. So I think countries that manage to get DPI right actually are setting themselves up for great success further down the road, and also to take advantage of other innovations and technology developments that might occur further down. So that's what I have to say for now, and I'll yield the mic.
For me, from the experience that I've been hearing from Sharad and learning about India, is that what worked well was that the DPI was built on very good ethical morality. Like, it's really for human, citizen-centered and for societal development. That's really something that India did very well. And the focus on transparency, I think there's no question I have asked anybody in terms of what DPI is and what they want to do from the India side that has really not been answered. And from what I've seen, it's an open one where the source code is shared. If somebody wants to build their platform on top of what they've built, it's something that they're looking forward to. So, and I'm a champion of open source. If something is not open, there's something, okay, open is debatable, but that open up to so far, it has done so well for the community. And then they foster collaboration. I think they've opened their model to other countries. I think it's 10 countries that are already using the India DPI model now. So for me, that says a lot. If you are willing to foster collaboration, because we don't want to repeat the same thing, spend money that's not needed on things that are needed. And being a South African, I think it spoke a lot to me. Those were the key. I'll stop there now, but I just want to say, as a South African, trust is very important. When you say digital in South Africa, we already think of the negatives. I mean, one of the biggest conglomerate in South Africa, it's building its biggest building I've ever seen on top of a river. And that river is been supplying a lot of fishes and something in the ocean. It's not just any river. It's got a lot of history. The Khoisan's history resides on that river. And I drive past the river every day, and I'm looking at this building going up every day, and I ask myself, I wonder what's happening in the ocean for this. So I'll see and I'll hear about that in the next 10 years, because at the moment, the building is going up and it's in Cape Town. So you ask yourself, yes, this is a big company. They're going to provide skills in tech. They're going to provide jobs. They're going to change the lives of the people. But what about the rights of the oceans and the fishes and those that can't speak for themselves? They're depending on humanity to save them. So for me, that's the other element that DPI should focus on. And every time I spoke to Sharad, he kept on saying the rights, the rights. So, and our T20 made sure that that word is included there. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here from a small country in Canada to the most populous country in the world. I feel intimidated, but thank you for the invitation. So on digital public infrastructure, I mean, I think a good starting point is to just reflect on what it means, because it is an emerging concept and we have to kind of keep thinking it through, right, as it emerges. But it is obviously in the digital era, we are now entering a new period of infrastructure. When you think of traditional infrastructure emerging, roads, railways, etc., this was about the movement of people and the movement of goods in an essential way for building society, for building the economy. We've now shifted to an era where the movement of data is going to be equally significant, right? So this is a fundamental shift, but in many ways there are parallels probably to the way that it evolved in the traditional infrastructure space. So there's lessons to learn there. And I think, so that one of the first things that comes to mind when you discuss this is, why is public in there? Why is the word public in this concept? And that's fundamental to address straight on, right? That it's a foundational issue for society and economy, as I said. And I think that for that reason, it's so important that public has to be central. Traditional infrastructure has often and even usually included a public element, right? When you think of public transportation, public education, sometimes health, but not, so, you get the sense that infrastructure has emerged in a way which is often included public, recognizing the essentialness of it, but not always included it. And what has happened here in the digital space is that things have evolved so quickly and have scaled up so quickly that the public interest and the centrality of the public has not been necessarily thought out and kind of structured in the same way that it probably should have been. So there's some catching up to do here. The next point I would make would be on the Canadian experience. I think that our experience, when you think of the India stack approach to this with first of all, some kind of digital ID, or even more broadly, just some kind of data starting point, right? In the Canadian context, that is very much a public issue, and there is an established system. It's not perfect. In many ways, India would be ahead of Canada on this, I would say. The second one of the kind of the system of settlement, let's call it, not necessarily financial settlement or payment, but some kind of settlement system. In the Canadian context, that has typically been probably 100% private, if not 100%, but close to it, right? I think India's about 50-50. Where countries go on that, I think, is going to be interesting. The last component of that India stack model of the data governance, I think, is where the contested space is right now globally. It's certainly the case in Canada, where there hasn't really been a decision on what is public, what is private. A lot of it has been first mover, where large companies have just established ways of doing things. Consumers have responded. It can kind of get locked in, not necessarily reflecting the public interest. So those kind of debates are happening now. And I'm going to, when we go in the next round, I'm going to talk about some of the emerging technologies and how they're playing in that, central bank digital currencies, et cetera. The final word that I would say is that for India, it seems to me that this is very much a soft power moment where India can lead. DPI is a perfect example where it's here's lessons that we've learned, here's some technology transfer, but in a a very cooperative, kind of collaborative G20 spirit. Thanks.
Sometimes big ideas emerge from very humble beginnings. So you heard about India Stack, and I just want to introduce the person who's actually made this happen. Her name is Rajani. If you Google this, Rajani India Stack, you'll find a 2013-2014 slide on the internet, which has these concentric circles. She's a street vendor, and she's a real street vendor, although we don't use her real name. And back in 2013, there was a simple dream. And that dream was that, can we give her a formal loan? She takes an intraday loan. She takes a loan in the morning, buys something wholesale, puts up a stall, and retires the loan in the evening and pays 1% a day for it, which is more than 300% a year. And our thought was that as India, could we bring her into the formal system? To bring her in the formal system in 2013, 2014, you had to do a paper KYC. And you referred to eKYC a little while back. So eKYC was invented for Rajani. And of course, many of you here who are Indians experienced it when Jio used it to give out its SIM. 200 million people signed up for it in 200 days. But actually, the original person it was meant for was Rajani. Then she needed to sign a loan agreement, right? So how does she sign a loan agreement? We needed electronic signing for a street vendor on a regular phone, not even a smartphone. So e-sign was invented. Today, India does more e-signs in India than any other country. In fact, more than 2 times as many e-signs in India as the US. But it was originally invented for Rajani. Then you needed to send her that 400, 500 rupees and take it back. The only way to do that was on debit card. And debit card companies said we'll charge 1% on the way out and 1% on the way in. How does it make sense to eliminate a money lender charging 1% and give it to Visa and MasterCard, a foreign companies at that? It didn't make sense. So UPI was actually invented for Rajani. Then if you have 2 Rajanis, one who pays on time and one who doesn't pay on time, the one who pays on time should get lower interest. But do you think our lenders would do that? No, they would only do that if she threatens to take her business somewhere else. Taking her business somewhere else means taking her data somewhere else. That is why a system was invented called the account aggregator, which has gone on, which is now going mainstream literally as we speak, which is our data sharing system. I could go on and on. So essentially everything that you hear about India Stack has been built for Rajani. But along the way, we realized that the only way to make this happen is if we saw this flow of people through the systems, flow of money, flow of information as public infrastructure, as Paul pointed out, because it's foundational in nature. So a test of that idea, I think there are 2 tests of that idea. One is, does it work on the ground? That you will agree with me, it works on the ground. Today we'll do more UPI transactions in India than China, Korea, all of Middle East, France, UK, and US put together. They're not being done by you. You have credit cards. But there are only 25 million people in India who have credit cards. It's being done by Rajani, like people who can't get a credit card. They are the ones who are driving this payment revolution in India, right? So the first test is, does it work on the ground? And that's very important. Second, as a democracy, as perhaps the oldest democracy, and certainly the biggest democracy, does it change the citizen-state relationship? If at all it changes it, does it change it in the favor of the citizen? And therefore, we've had to prove again and again that it is not a tool for authoritarianism. Public infrastructure does not mean authoritarianism. Our Supreme Court has looked at it thrice, and now a consensus has emerged. In fact, our identity system is now in 10 countries. As of today, 85 million people using it. Will reach 500 million people in roughly probably 18 months or so. So first is, just 1 minute, and I'll finish. And so first is, does it work on the ground? Second is, does it result in authoritarianism? Third, in India, if the government was to run this, it won't work. So we had to make it privately provisioned public infrastructure. Our airports are good because they're privately provisioned public infrastructure. If the government was running the airports, they won't be that good, right? So you needed to do that. And how do you make sure monopolization doesn't happen and people are not exploited by those private parties? So UPI is run by private players, but it is free for our citizens. How do you make this magic happen? So this is really a set of learnings that are now available to the rest of the world, and we'll come back and talk more about it a little later.
No, thank you. I mean, I think that across the sort of brought out some really interesting considerations. One, about sort of what works. So I think what we see, as Sharad, you brought out in the case of India, is this sort of careful thinking about what the citizen looks like and what their circumstances are. Paul also indicated that it is a bit possibly more of a complex question as we look globally about what public interest looks like. And how do we how do we think about that? And I think, Beratang, also your comment about thinking about within South Africa, questions of trust from the onset in the process, I think was also really important. I think also, so that's what I wanted to do with this sort of next round of questions, was to have us think from what you've just sort of shared, is to where do we take this next and how do we look forward? And one of the things that's unavoidable, is discussions about generative AI or discussions about what's happening as we start to see these large language models based on these these data sets of what already exists that are processing, often in ways that we don't see, and that's moving forward massively and what seems to be very quickly. And as technology changes in this way, it provides a really interesting context for us to think about, well, we've seen what's happened with digital public infrastructure in these cases. Well, what next? And what does digital public infrastructure look like that is equipped for AI as we're seeing at this moment, but also equipped for AI as it's going to look like in the next year, the next 5 years, the next technology AI. It's not necessarily going to be AI in the next 5 years that we're talking about. And so what I wanted to pose to the panel now was this more forward-looking perspective and thinking, as you've already started to raise, possibly what are some of the issues that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about digital public infrastructure in this context of changing technology in the directions that we've seen it starting to go over the last sort of 6 to 12 months. Or alternative, if you don't want to talk about the issues, what do you see from digital public infrastructure that can offer us insights for trying to ensure both innovation and a people-centered approach or framework for AI or for evolving technology? It's a big question, but let's push this discussion forward and think about what we can take from what you've shared about how we might think about digital public infrastructure. Sharad, do you want to start? And we'll end with Hendrik, and I'm going to keep you to 4 minutes each because I want to have some questions.
So the top layer of India Stack is actually to do with data. What's the digital infrastructure needed for moving data, right? And so one kind of data that you have to move is personal data. That is called in India the DEPA, Digital Empowerment and Protection Architecture, DEPA inference cycle, which means I can send all my data to a doctor, I can send it to a lender, they can infer what's wrong with me, whether I'm eligible for a loan, things like that. And that system is now ramping very quickly. But very often that doctor or lender will use an AI model to actually make that inference. We are not very far away. When you go to the doctor and show them what it is, they'll have a bot AI system that will help them make a better decision, just like a pilots use an AI system to fly the plane. And this will be true also for the lenders. So the question for us is, what will be that AI economy like? And do we live in a world where there are going to be many AI models, or do we live in a world where there are only 2 AI models? Obviously, our desire is that there are many AI models. Now, if I'm a modeler in India and I want to develop a model, or in Canada or anywhere here, then for me to be a good modeler, I need access to training data. Without access to training data, I cannot be a good modeler. And if that access to training data is available to me only in the US, then US will be the dominant country in producing those models. So important for us is to unleash this possibility that training data can be made available to me as a modeler more easily in India than, let's say, in the US. That's the system India is going to introduce in July of this year. It's called the DEPA training cycle. Why is it significant is that India, unlike the US, is taking a techno-legal approach, a technology and legal approach to ensure that when I get that data to train my model, privacy of the people who contributed that data, whose data it is, that aggregate data is not compromised. And that is ensured with computational guarantees rather than legal guarantees. And why is that important in India is because if I have legal guarantees, enforcing those legal guarantees in our court system is very hard. Our courts, while very well-meaning, they take forever to resolve these issues and therefore they're very difficult to do. So we are enforcing those guarantees, privacy guarantees in code rather than in courts. Now, this is a necessity for us. It's not a necessity in many parts of the Western world because they have a court system that works differently. But that's something that we need to do. It allowed us, again, to stumble into a way of doing things that perhaps will be important to many others outside of India. So I'll end by saying that what India is going to do is going to create a well-regulated and open market between training data providers and training data consumers. And to do that, it will provide a new type of digital public infrastructure to enable that market and to regulate that market. So this is really what is coming. We think India will be the third approach. The US is already an established approach. In 2020, China laid out its own approach, which of course is not acceptable to many democracies. And India's approach is going to be the third approach. Watch out for more in the coming months. Thank you.
Well, it's hard to top that. But let me just say that, when you think of the evolution here again, approximately 100 years ago, people had difficulty moving themselves or goods very far away from their communities, right? And now suddenly we have, amazing infrastructure. Now the digital revolution means that data moves very quickly and it automatically creates a global interface, which creates both an opportunity and a challenge, right? So the opportunity is to connect to the global data and digital infrastructure, and the challenge is to have things imposed upon you by that structure, right? So that's the dynamic that's going on right now. I think that the technology is moving very quickly right now. I'm going to mention three things going even beyond artificial intelligence, but let me start with artificial intelligence about in my mind, there's no doubt that artificial intelligence will be central to the way that the digital public infrastructure emerges. The question is, I think, as was stated, how much is in your control? How much of that is a tool that is based on data you control as a country level or a regional level? And how do you maximize the usefulness of that artificial intelligence without being reliant on other algorithms? And the good news is that AI is quite scalable and transferable. So as long as there is an open system, of which there are hints now that things could go well, but it's moving so quickly right now that this is a top priority for everyone to be focused on. How will AI integrate into DPI? I would add two other things to this. One would be digital currencies, particular central bank digital currencies, but digital currencies in general. They're coming in some form or another, but it is very much unknown at this point. And that mix of public and private is once again playing out. Would this be a central bank digital currency controlled by the Federal Reserve Bank of India, for example? I know people have spoken very highly of them, but are they ready to do something like that? In Canada's case, we're not sure that the Bank of Canada is the place to manage. Yeah. Right, but will it ultimately be something that government controls, or will it need to be something that's more private sector led in the implementation? So those are happening worldwide, and I think that will have an implication. I think quantum was mentioned yesterday, and so let me say on quantum computing, that it's here already. There are functioning quantum computers at a small scale with just a couple of qubits. But that's something that's coming sooner rather than later. So how would that be integrated, right? And it's probably more fundamental than when suddenly air flight emerged to a ground-based transportation system and had to be integrated. Quantum will be a little bit more fundamental than that, but it will still have to kind of work in parallel to the DPI. So there are a lot of challenges on the horizon with the way the technology will evolve. But I do feel that DPI is the right foundational frame, but it's going to have to be nimble regulation, nimble policy making to move forward. Thanks.
When Paul was speaking, I remembered that I think midnight, I was still awake. I read an article saying EU has approved their AI policy, voted by all. And I said, I better start it quick because they forgot to put Africa in front. They should have said EU and Africa. Because whether the government is doing well in South Africa or whether the private sector is doing well, I think we don't trust anyone in terms of who's doing it. Maybe if it's coming from the academia, people are like, okay, maybe. So I like the fact that you said it's a public, what word to use, Sharad?
Public interest.
Yeah, it's a public interest model because whether DPI is there or it's gonna work, or it really depends on who's gonna introduce it. Because if it's the government, we're not gonna trust it. We're gonna think, somebody in Europe might have helped them to write this, or someone who's in charge. Questions are gonna rise, and for it to move forward, it has to be clear. That can only be done if the government is really going to do big public campaigns to educate the public. What is DPI? Why is it important? And what are you going to do with my data when you take it? Because anything can happen. And then the other thing is the awareness of where is it going to be. There should be clear guidelines on who's responsible for what. It's okay, you build it for that woman to get what she wants. But 10, 20 years down the line, who's responsible for what? And that I'm saying because I'm a black woman sitting in front of a crowd that doesn't understand how it is to be a black woman that's being excluded all the time in your life. So the data that exists on the internet, if you asked it, who's Bharata Mia? I had to correct it. It said, I'm sorry, I didn't know who you are. But the whole world knows who's Bharata Mia. When they want to call me to come and talk to them, they call me. But AI doesn't know me. And that is because AI at the moment is still carrying the biases, is still carrying everything that we have to deal with. And as a minority of someone who's not represented very well in the tech, I always feel like if you're going to talk about anything to me that says technology, I have to raise my ears and say, did you worry about the biases that are going to be carried by your AI? Did you think about how it's going to be inclusive? And what is the diversity of that? You might be tired of it, but the reality is that's what I'm sitting here thinking, okay, how is DPI going to make sure that the future is equitable and inclusive and the society benefits from this digital future because we can't say everybody should be digital. We can't exclude anyone. That's right. So I will close by saying it should be fair. And fair should be fair. Fair shouldn't be, it's fair to all of us. Fair should mean we are including those who were excluded in the past. We are redressing the past, at the same time being fair to those who are going to benefit.
So the benefits of being the last one here is that I can get to say that I agree with everything and that's it. Okay, but on the point on the future of DPI moving forward, I think as I said earlier, there really is great demand for DPI. If you look at COVID, for example, right, the need for what you call vaccine certificates, for vaccine passports, all of this together with digital economy imperatives, actually push the demand for DPI. So if you look over the past 8 years alone, from 2014 all the way to 2021, 80 countries have launched initiatives to, at some form of government technology, GovTech, right, which is the use of technology to deliver government services. Not so very different from DPI. And out of these 80 countries, 50 of them are LMICs, lower middle income countries. And if you look, I work very closely with governments of LMICs on their digitalization approaches and strategies. And I find that, moving forward, besides having the key critical enablers in place, you look at things like connectivity, digital literacy, I think it's also very important that there is, for governments who are looking to adopt the DPI approach within their countries, is that you really need that stakeholder buy-in. You need that central, government agencies. All of them need to be on board. You need to have a strategy, a national strategy. Because what I find most of the time is that in the absence of this kind of strategies and buy-in, you have a lot of fragmented efforts, and they don't really end up anywhere. You have piecemeal digitalization here and there, and it doesn't make for a very pretty picture when you try to scale it, or you try to look at it from a national central perspective. So this is what I would say about the future of AI, future of DPI. And on the topic of AI, yes, there's a lot of, my dear speaker to the right has said, there's a lot of discussion about AI principles, but I find that of the 193 countries, represented within the UN, right, a lot of these principles are actually very, pardon me, my European friends, very Eurocentric. I know that the OECD has talked about, the need for OECD AI principles, but I find that, like for example, my African colleagues are not particularly well represented in this regard, and I think there is a need to take into account their voices to make sure that they are represented. As for a global consensus, on AI governing frameworks, I think the main barrier nowadays is that, we talk about AI, which is fundamentally, machine learning, which is driven by data, right? You talk about data to policymakers and immediately all the barriers come up. They're like, yeah, this is a matter of national security, all the political barriers come up. So I think, it's a good first step would be to, start talking about, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about AI, data governance? How should we manage these transnational border data flows without, having all these political barriers being put into place? So I think that should serve, having those kind of discussions like the ones we are having now would serve as a very good first step towards, having a DPI and, AI-driven digital economy worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you. So on that, I'm going to open the floor to questions. We only have about 6 or 7 minutes left. We're going to end on time. So I think I'll take around 3 questions maybe. I'll take them in a row. Please keep them to questions. If you have comments, grab the panelists after, and you can tell them your comments. And I'll give you each 3 questions and then probably 30 seconds to 1 minute to respond. So use your time smartly. So I can see one hand there. Do I have any? I want to make sure I have any women with a question. So we'll take front row, you in the back with a very dramatic hand. And do we have any women with their hands up? Just to get some gender balance in the questions. Any women? I can't see. I see hands in the back if you see. And the lady in the back. So we have you, brown shirt, and lady in the back. And any more questions? Please grab our panelists. They're here.
So my question to the panelists is, how do you ensure that AI-driven DPI is fair, egalitarian, and transparent when digital technology, digital infrastructure, digital data, digital HR capabilities are not evenly distributed around the world? How do you ensure that such a system is fair, equitable, and transparent?
Warm regards to all the speakers, ladies and gentlemen sitting here. My name is Ujjwal Sonkar. I'm a researcher in Indo-Russian relations, and currently I'm researching about quantum technology into security applications. As you see, and as we just heard, that quantum is a reality, and there are already working supercomputers. The evolution of quantum technology possesses a great risk, as it has the potential to bypass the current encryption protocols which are widely used, such as RSA, AES, and so on and so forth. I'm pretty much interested to know your opinion that how the research on post-quantum cryptography is essential for securing the data for ensuring the national integrity of our nation. Thank you.
Thank you. And then to the woman in the back, and then I'll let you all respond. You can choose.
My question is to Sharat Sarma, sir. Sir, I'm Yuvraj Oza from Jain College, Mumbai. And my question is, like, India has made a significant progress in domestic financial technologies, as you mentioned, such as the widely accessible UPI and the UPI 123 payment system for the non-smartphone users. And the system like ONDC in implementation and pre-sanctioned credit line through UPI. Considering cross-border transactions, some countries like the BRICS nation are exploring alternatives to the US dollar, such as developing CBDCs, and countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and other 18 countries, I guess, have been invited to join the cross-border transaction system. So the plan to establish and provide alternative loan to the IMF and World Bank, how would this impact the world economy shifting from the dollar economy, and can digital rupee play a significant role here?
Thank you. All right, so you can see the clock in front of you. We have 40 seconds per person. I'll start on this side, move down.
Okay, so I'll tackle Ambassador Shinoy's question on how to ensure that AI is fair, right? So I think a very good first start would be to break down silos that exist between, for example, engineers and policymakers. I've worked in a lot of situations where, the engineering team, very well, but they are clueless about the idea of fairness and equitable, right? So I think that would be a very, very good first start. And for the gentleman's question about, the post-quantum cryptography. So, you might be familiar, right? So just as quantum is used to, crack, cryptographic methods, the same ways can be used, as using quantum as an alternative. So there was this method known as SHA-1, which was broken, and now you have alternatives. So I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Perfect.
I think ensuring that everything is fair in this world, you must have ethical guidelines, and they shouldn't be driven by the tech industry. All stakeholders should agree on these guidelines. But you don't want to stifle innovation when you do that, because what happens is, I can talk about women's rights day and night, but at the same time, I do know that it's necessary for some people to do their business, and they are too far ahead to go back and change their models. So if we all agree that the guidelines should address issues such as privacy, security, transparency, and accountability, I think we'll have a better guideline.
So quickly on the three issues. On the first one, data, I think that is about data sovereignty, in the sense that on issues of core national interest, you have to control that data, health data, etc. Other global data can still work. So there's not a contradiction in my view, but it has to be managed carefully. On the post-quantum, the quantum issue, yes, this is something that's being worked on, and I would agree with the previous comment that there are ways to quantum computer-proof data systems that should hold. But it does introduce a whole new level of risk and cyber attacks through a quantum vector, for sure. On the final point, I can't resist commenting on the reserve currency aspirations of the BRICS and others. At the end of the day, it's countries that decide, and partners that trade, that decide which currency they want to use, and that has to be a credible currency for both trading and reserve assets. And when that appears, it can push out other currencies.
You still get your full 40 seconds.
I don't have anything to add to the reserve currency, because I'm a techie. What do I know about that? But I can say a few words about the AI question. Clearly, ethics and fairness, and those kind of issues, even alignment with human aspirations, are very important things. And you need to be able to test models, whether they deliver those or not. And we already live in a world that if you take an app and try and upload it on the Apple Store or the Google Store, they take a few days before it'll be authorized, because they test for it and say, is it malicious or not malicious? So our view is that ultimately we need this to happen to models. Before models go wild and are generally available and distributed, there has to be some testing so that they're labeled and people know what the model's biases or features, or because some things that we think of bugs are features, some things that we think of features are bugs. And so that testing is going to be very important. But that testing makes no sense. Yeah, testing makes no sense if there are only 2 model makers in the world. Yeah. So you need 20,000 model makers in the world. And to have 20,000 model makers in the world, you need digital public infrastructure to liberate innovation so that every part of the world is making models that are relevant to them. So I would say it's not AI infusing DPI, it is DPI for AI. Without DPI for AI, you will not have fireflies lighting up the sky. And if you don't have fireflies lighting up the sky, you won't have the ability to pick and choose the good models and reject the bad models.
Thank you. That was a good point to end on. I think really gets back to one of the benefits of this panel being its global perspective. So thank you very much, Sharad, Paul, Baratang, and Kendrick. And I'll hand back to organizers.